Last time we looked at Gathering Storm and Scorch, and when one of them becomes better than the other. This time I want to look at the defensive equivalent of Scorch, Bone Plating. However, instead of comparing it with just one other rune, this time will be a double feature. We will look at both Conditioning and Overgrowth in comparison. Before we can look at the way these runes interact with each other, we first have to remind ourselves what they do exactly. Bone Plating, our headliner, is a rune that triggers upon taking champion damage, and for the next 1.5 seconds, it will reduce the next 3 attacks or spells from the champion that triggered it only by a flat amount that scales with your level. Conditioning lays dormant for the first 12 minutes of the game, and then activates to grant you a small flat amount of resistances, and increases your total resistances by a percentage. Finally, Overgrowth grants you bonus health whenever a certain amount of monsters or enemy minions die near you, and after having seen enough creatures die near you, your maximum health is increased by a percentage. There are very clearly situations in which these runes either vastly outperform or vastly underperform from their average value. Bone Plating can be poked off. If you're only hit by a single ability or auto attack of an enemy, Bone Plating doesn't do anything until its cooldown comes back up 45 seconds later, as the damage reduction doesn't work on the instance of damage that activates it. On the other hand, Conditioning just does absolutely nothing for the first 12 minutes of the game. Overgrowth is Conditioning light in that sense. It only reaches its main value after having seen 120 minions or monsters die. However, it doesn't jump up from 0 to 100, it more gradually increases. Additionally, Overgrowth keeps scaling afterwards, although it is rather slowly. Before we look at the numbers and the visualization, I think it's interesting to consider what we expect to see. Which stats are good for the different runes, which stats do the same for every rune, and which stats interact less favorably with a specific rune. For example, healing and shielding, as well as your passive regeneration, is more efficient on targets with more resistances, so Conditioning loves all of those. Looking at the core defensive stats. Health becomes more efficient if you have more resistances, so Overgrowth really likes it when you have a lot of resistances. But it also doesn't increase your health by a flat amount. Well, it also increases your health by a flat amount, but more importantly, it gives a percentage, so that means it prefers high HP targets. The same idea in reverse applies to Conditioning. Resistances are better if you have more health, so Conditioning wants high HP targets. But it increases your resistance by a percentage, so that effect would prefer higher resistance values instead. Clearly for those two it isn't quite so easy. Luckily for us, it is that easy when looking at Bone Plating. Bone Plating reduces damage by a flat amount after resistances. It effectively is just flat health, or a shield or a heal if that's easier to visualize for you. It does better with high resistance values and doesn't change at all depending on your health. Although of course there's also the level factor to consider with Bone Plating. Alright, all of that out of the way, let's go to our first chart, Bone Plating versus Conditioning. Just to be clear, we are looking at total tankiness from 100 to 0, which you can also think of as a single big team fight. There are other ways to compare the runes, some of which I will get to later. We have 3 variables here, our level, our health, and our resistances. I found the point at which both runes provide the same value. Increasing the health from the break-even point only benefits Conditioning, so that is where Conditioning provides more. But decreasing it only harms Conditioning. So by looking at it from that perspective, it also shows us where Bone Plating does better. Healing and shielding is effectively just flat health. So a character with 1500 HP that isn't healed at all, and a character with 1000 health that receives 500 healing would both be at 1500 on this graph. A character with 2000 health that is missing 500 health would also be equivalent for that matter. We will come back to that a bit later. Alright, let's remove a dimension from this graph so it is easier to wrap our head around what we are actually seeing here. Now we can only see level 6, which is the earliest reasonable level you could have Conditioning at. let's focus on how the curve behaves with higher resistances. You need more health to break even. This shouldn't be that surprising after we spent some time earlier going over what benefits the individual runes earlier, but I think it is worth reiterating. Conditioning's flat resistances are much more important than its percentage increase. A flat amount of health benefits more from additional resistances as we follow this curve left than the percentage increase that conditioning provides to its resistances. Okay, let's slowly add the third dimension back. These are levels 7, 8, 9 and 10, much more common starting points for conditioning, especially for non-supports. Obviously, the break-even point goes up since bone plating's damage reduction scales up with level. Now here are the levels until level 14, and finally these are levels 15 to 18. So we can have something to compare this to. Here are the health ranges among all characters before any bonuses. And these are the resistance ranges. To note, these do look a bit more extreme because resistances includes both MR and armor. The lower bound here is the lowest MR values and the upper bound is the highest armor values. We can see that naturally squishy characters that don't itemize defensively, so characters at this extreme or at least closer to this edge than to the other edges, will always get more out of bone plating than out of conditioning. As characters get tankier, we can see that it looks like there are some that benefit more from conditioning even before items, but this is a bit misleading. Characters that have above average health tend to have above average resistances as well. There's a correlation here. Still, we can see the gap clearly does get smaller for tankier characters. We will get back to this graph a bit later, but for now, let's just jump to our second graph, Overgrowth and bone plating. I should mention this at some point, and this is as good a moment as any. Yes, these runes don't compete directly with each other, since they aren't on the same row. However, if you're running Resolve Secondary, you pick 2 runes out of 3 possible rows, so they indirectly compete with each other there. And even when they don't compete with each other at all, it is nice knowing how strong each rune is. So you can make a better informed decision. Do you pick Resolve because you want bone plating and you just get Overgrowth because you have to pick a second rune, or is it the other way around? Both runes get the same advantages from resistances. So instead of resistances, we now look at stacks of Overgrowth on one of the axes. I assume that we have 120 stacks already as a bare minimum, which is when the percentage increase happens. Before 120 stacks, they don't really fit on the same scale. Overgrowth is really far behind. Let's again remove one of these dimensions. This is only level 6. For numbers above 2000 health, our line leaves the graph to the right, which means that Overgrowth is better the second you hit 120 stacks to activate the percentage health increase. Adding some more levels, unsurprisingly, bone plating gets stronger as our level increases, so we need either more health or more Overgrowth stacks to catch up to it. Putting the rest of the levels on the graph again, more of what we expected. Let's switch which dimension we remove for this graph. Looking at it from this perspective, you can see the health needed to make any stacks past 120 unnecessary, since Overgrowth will always be better. That's all the lines that cut off at the top before they reach the top of the graph area. And it also shows at which levels 200 stacks, that's just the back wall in this case, is enough regardless of the health you have. 200 stacks is pretty arbitrary though, so how about we bring back the ranges of health characters have at different levels. We can bring this out to any amount of stacks we are interested in and compare against that. In the case of 200 stacks, it shows us that we really shouldn't be worried about theoretically needing that many stacks to break even at the higher levels, because at those levels all characters have more health anyway. As we bring this out more, we reach 170 stacks, which is where the level 18 line intersects it. So even the absolutely squishiest character gets more out of Overgrowth than out of bone plating at 170 stacks. Bringing it out a bit more to 150, we can see that level 17, 16 and 50 now intersected, which we interpret to mean that 150 stacks is enough for every character to prefer Overgrowth even at those levels. Jumping ahead a bit to around 80 stacks, this is where the top of our range comes into play. For a lot of levels, basically level 18 down to level 10, the break-even point intersects the top of our range, which means the tankiest characters only need 80 stacks for Overgrowth to be better before any items. Moving it a bit more forward, at 70 stacks, all of the break-even points pass above our range, meaning every character would need help from items to break even before 70 stacks. More interesting to me is this visualization at 100 stacks though. All lines, except for level 6, but let's ignore that, intersect the range at some point here and show how characters of different tankiness behave differently with these runes. At the higher levels, the squishy characters are quite a bit below the break-even points, while tankier characters have hit it already. In the mid-level range, the break-even point travels lower and lower through the champion range, showing how more and more characters will break even. Though this raises the question, when do we realistically hit 100 stacks? Or really 220 stacks? Since up until now I have been talking about stacks above 120 when the rune fully activates. Obviously this depends on a number of factors, but as a benchmark, a solo laner that never shares experience, never missed a minion of experience and never farmed jungle camps or got experience from something else will hit this at level 12, which is just after 17 minutes. Obviously, the more experience you share, the lower your level will be, but something like level 6 at the stack count is not very realistic anyway. You can also look at how much health you would need for Overgrowth to be better immediately. That would be the difference between the tip of the black line at a certain level to a spot somewhere in the red area, depending on which character you're looking at, which I think we could judge at around 1000 health. Summing all of this up, bone plating will always be better when hitting 120 stacks, but after another 100 stacks, Overgrowth will be comparable or better depending on champion, and any full item with a health component will make it so basically every character prefers Overgrowth. Going over to the third graph, this isn't the focus at all, but we might as well compare conditioning and Overgrowth while we're at it. In this case, resistances are relevant again, but level is not relevant anymore, so I replaced that axis. Something quite annoying for us is that healing is now a bit more complicated. We can't just consider additional health, since that would be multiplied by Overgrowth's percent modifier. Instead, I put 2 break-even points on this graph. This assumes no healing, and this assumes we're healed or shielded for half of our health over the course of a fight. Let's first look at the 1000 health curve for 50% healing. We can see that as the resistance increases for this, the stacks needed goes down. This confirms our idea from before that the flat amount of resistances from conditioning is much more important than the percentage increase. Likewise, we can look at the 40 resistance curve and we will see that as health increases, the amount of stacks needed also increases. Overgrowth synergizes with resistances better than conditioning does, and conditioning synergizes with health better than Overgrowth does. The no healing favors Overgrowth quite heavily, as we can see. These are our health and resistance ranges again, with the level scaling somewhat arbitrarily attached to the amount of Overgrowth stacks. 0 stacks being level 6, 100 being level 12 and 200 being level 18, all above our assumed 120 baseline. Our ranges never go above the break-even points, which is when conditioning does better. Looking at 50% healing on the other hand, has Overgrowth never outperforming. Anyway, this doesn't include bone plating, which is our focus, so I'll just leave that as is and go back to our first graph again. I hope we can understand a bit better what we're seeing after we saw all 3 of these relationships. Bone plating did fine against Overgrowth, but it got outscaled somewhere around the 220 stacks mark, or roughly 20 minutes into the game. Overgrowth crushes conditioning, unless you have a lot of healing and shielding, so it isn't surprising putting those 2 ideas together that bone plating does better than conditioning unless you have some serious healing or shielding, or in this case flat health, which we can use interchangeably, but that is less likely to happen. We should also note that bone plating starts ahead by a lot, but conditioning does get closer and closer because the health we gain per level outpaces bone plating's own scaling. Let's get rid of this generalized abomination for now and look at some actual examples, some actual characters that get played with items they build. Let's start with Jhin. Very simple, as he doesn't tend to get additional health or resistances from his itemization, except for Dawn's Blade, which is why we have a thin stripe instead of a line representing his health. Continuing with bot lane, Lulu. I assume a finished support item as a baseline, and then we see in order Chevaliers or Moonstone, Redemption, and finally Mikael's, adding health or resistances. Even with this much HP built in her first two items, it takes until level 12 for conditioning to barely break even. And if she builds Mikael's before Redemption, or just no Redemption at all, which is totally plausible, bone plating will be better continuously. If we consider physical damage instead, her higher armor value means that even without building any additional armor, conditioning doesn't break even. Making our way up the map, we have Victor as a mid lane mage next. Shadow Flame adds some HP, as does Doran's Wing if he still has it, and Zhonya's could potentially add some armor. Without the armor, he is pretty close to breaking even, but with it bone plating triumphs by a decent margin. That is until we consider his Q shield. The AP is a bit arbitrary here, but just as a rough illustration, late game, about 2 Qs would be enough to break even. In the mid game you would need 3 to 4 in most cases. This curve shows Lee Sin. He builds a Gore Drinker, then a Death Stance, and finally I added on the armor from Tabby's. I did not include Tabby's passive because, you know, it's unclear how much it actually does depending on abilities and how much you attacked and so on. Even if we're assuming Mercs and no Death Stance, conditioning does substantially better against magic damage because MR values are just that much lower naturally. And finally, I wanted to add a full tank. I chose a support full tank with Nautilus. In order, here we are adding the stats from Locket, then his W shield, and finally the Locket active. Even without the active of Locket, which to be fair has twice the cooldown that bone plating has, conditioning does better starting at level 10. His W shield helps a ton. Before going to a conclusion, I want to address some concerns people tend to have with bone plating. First, what if I get engaged on by a support who does no damage and bone plating only protects me from them and not from the real damage dealers? Well, let's look at an example. Let's say an Alistar W's, Q's and autos me twice. W will proc bone plating so it won't be reduced, then for Q I would need to have more than 300 MR for it to deal less damage than bone plating blocks. For his auto attack it is less extreme, but putting us both at level 10 I would need above 100 armor. Sure, this is something we can reach, however unless I have a lot more than 100 armor, we're only going to be missing out on minuscule damage blocking. Basically, support damage just is not that low. What should be a bigger concern is someone not hitting you 4 times in rapid succession, so 1 or 2 charges of bone plating time out. For example, Jhin has his static, very low attack speed, so he will rarely hit you often enough to proc bone plating fully. A subset of this problem would be characters that could hit you with a lot of abilities if you were their focus, but they actually focus someone else, so they will only hit you with 1 or 2 AoEs. For example, an Amumu hitting you with the edge of his ultimate. Both of these things are hard to fully account for, but they absolutely do harm bone plating's efficiency, at least to some degree. These are cases that I consider similar to Gathering Storm's wave clear from last time. Things that can't be made objective, or at least I can't. The goal here isn't to tell you that bone plating is the best in every situation and you should always pick it. Instead, the goal is to get people to consider the actually important factors, rather than dismissing one of these runes completely. If you assume to be often hit by the edge of an AoE, that is a really good reason to not pick bone plating, for example. And of course, there is the issue that bone plating can get poked off. If Aswell kills you a couple of seconds before the fight actually starts, you just won't have bone plating ready. However, what I think is often overlooked is that there's no posing effect as well. We can also potentially have multiple bone platings. At that point we're probably not looking at an individual fight anymore, but whenever you are in a fight and afterwards stay on the map long enough for bone plating to get ready again and fight another time, you are milking a lot of extra value out of bone plating. More generally, we can rephrase what the graph shows us. This isn't the HP you need to equal bone plating in a fight to the death, this is how much HP you must have lost in a fight to equal bone plating. This way of thinking is of course only valid if you don't fight until bone plating comes back up again, and it also raises the question how useful saving health is in different situations. For example, if you heal to full after the fight on a minion wave before you fight again, it doesn't really matter that you saved any health. The only important thing is that you did survive and got the chance to heal up again. But how often does this happen? How often do we reduce bone plating to it being poked off before fight? And on the other hand, how often do we get multiple uses out of bone plating within our same health bar? Well, I went through a couple of games, in this case 5 games played by Tolkien, and uploaded to his YouTube, and noted how often bone plating was lost before a fight, as well as how often he stayed on the map and fought again with a recharged bone plating. And the short answer is, getting multiple bone platings is more common than not getting value out of it at all. For more details, check the document I link in the description. Alright, all of that out of the way, here is my personal conclusion from the data. Assuming I don't play against Jace, Nidalee, Zoe, Karma, Ezreal, bone plating should be the go-to over conditioning. Unless you are expecting large amounts of healing, shielding, or want to protect against magic damage, but won't buy a lot of magic resistance. Buying high amounts of HP is also a way for conditioning to be better, but I think the Lulu, Lee Sin and Victor examples show that you need multiple big ticket items for that, and at that point we're so late into the game that I don't really want to target my rune setup for that. Bone plating versus Overgrowth just comes down to whether you are fine waiting for 220 stacks, which comes around at 20 minutes if you're farming a lane. If your first item provides any health, I think the timing window for bone plating becomes too short and Overgrowth becomes clearly better in almost all cases. And the only way I would pick conditioning instead of Overgrowth would be if I have a lot of healing in my kit or plan to build a lot of healing. But more importantly than a punchy conclusion, I hope you can at least appreciate the different factors that go into the runes a bit more and make a more educated decision based on team comp, damage profiles, expected builds, healing, etc. etc. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.